Oh, if these walls could talk. Oh, hello there. I hope I didn't startle you. My name is Lillian Wickersham, and I was the very first principal here at Roslyn Elementary when we first opened our doors back in September of 1926. I ran a very tight ship then, not like those softies you have today. Any child who got out of line? Well, let's just say it usually didn't happen twice. And I would make sure everyone marched in step, single file, to and from their classrooms every single day. Things were a lot different then, yes sirree, but what never changed was the school's commitment to excellent instruction. Because just like they are today, the children taught inside these walls represented our future, and we were determined to teach them to be the very best that Roslyn had to offer. Our story really begins back in the early 1800s, just as the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was forging the Common School Law, which created the public school system. Back then, Abington was called Moortown, and there were a few one-room schoolhouses dotting our area. There were no cars or even railroads or trolleys to get here. There was a stagecoach that stopped in Abington on its way from Philadelphia to Easton, a trip which took a total of 3 days. Roslyn was just a crossroads in the middle of nowhere. Just before the Common School Law, there was a one-room schoolhouse called the Valley School, just across from what's now Hillside Cemetery. It was built by John Tyson, sometime around 1822. Tyson was a wealthy landowner here who lived on what is now Woodland Road, which was called Tyson's Lane back then. Tyson and his father had built a successful business by operating lime kilns that were right near that house. In fact, some of the lime from Tyson's kilns was used during the construction of both Independence Hall and City Hall in Philadelphia. Tyson also quarried limestone in the area near the kilns, and his kilns and quarries were actually the very first industry in Abington. Anyway, legend has it that one of Tyson's sons had been attending the old Edge Hill School, which back then was near the corner of Edge Hill Road and Old York Road, when the boy was brutally flogged one day by his teacher. Tyson got so mad about this that he built the Valley School at his own expense and even supplied the teacher so that his son would have a new school to go to. With the passage of the Common School Law, by 1840, the Valley School had become Roslyn's first public school. There was one room, holding from 50 to 75 children. The benches extended the length of the building. The teacher's desk was on a raised platform at the front of the room. Behind it was the blackboard, and near at hand the traditional hickory switch. The school was heated by a stove, which had a very bad habit of smoking and nearly driving everyone out. The boys cut wood for the fire. The drinking water was carried from a nearby farmhouse. The children traveled to and from school by horses and carriages, and perhaps even by sleigh in winter. Animals and conveyances were parked in the nearby barn. The Valley School was operated until the opening of the new Plank Road School in 1858, on the northeast corner of Easton and Edge Hill Roads, where the SPCA now resides. The Plank Road School was an improvement over the Valley School, offering 2 rooms instead of 1. The school was so named because back then, Easton Road was called the Plank Road, owing to a new construction technique whereby wooden planks were laid down to make the roadbed. The Plank Road School operated until 1887, when the Weldon School was opened, just around the corner on Jenkintown Road. A year later, in 1888, Abington's first public high school was built, just off the corner of Susquehanna and Old York Roads. And it was decided at that time that Roslyn's elementary students would go there instead of Weldon. This was the first Abington public high school and included all the elementary grades and 2 years of high school. And many years later, it would become the school's administration building. Keep in mind, this was still a very rural community. The railroad finally came through here in 1872, and at that time, the station was named Hillside. But just about the only thing in this area other than Tyson's Kilns back then were a lot of farms. So although you could get to school via horse and carriage, the truth is that a lot of kids had to walk all the way from Roslyn. It wasn't until 1890 that Hillside Cemetery opened, along with the monument works that made gravestones. And it was also right around that time that rose growers started to set up greenhouses in this area to grow roses to be put on the graves. Most of the greenhouses were near Edgehill Road and Flory Lane, near Copper Beach, and there were also quite a few behind the Bradfield Mansion, where Gennardi's now stands. When we got our first post office in 1895, there was already another town in Pennsylvania named Hillside, so ours needed to be renamed. Back then, they would locate the post office in the train station. So both our train station and our village were renamed Roslyn on October 25, 1895. As for the name, it's reported that Mrs. George Kelly, a longtime resident who lived at the northern intersection of Bradfield and Easton Roads, had suggested the name Roslyn after her Scottish birthplace. In addition, the name Roslyn itself means Vale of Roses, so it's also thought the name was picked because of the many rose growers here, and because many homes in the area were known to have lovely rose gardens. Nearby, Willow Grove Park opened a year later in 1896. And if you ever wondered why Tyson Avenue today has its 2 lanes divided with parking in the center, well, it's because by 1905, they had built a trolley line running up the center of Tyson Avenue, which stopped in Roslyn and continued on to Willow Grove Park. In addition to park passengers, sometimes there would be special trolleys that would bring caskets of the deceased up here to Hillside Cemetery from Philadelphia. And rather than continue on to Willow Grove, there was a turnaround right there at the corner of Tyson Avenue and Easton Road. The caskets would then be loaded onto a carriage and brought down the hill to the cemetery. It may not have been the end of the line for the trolley, but I guess for the deceased, it was another matter. Finally, in 1918, Abington got its first school bus, although it still wasn't until 1924 that the streets were paved here. Highland Elementary opened in 1923, and Roslyn school kids went there for about 3 years. Here's a panoramic view of Roslyn from that time period of the mid-1920s, looking down on Easton Road from approximately where the Tyson Avenue Bridge would be. On the left, you can see the corner of Susquehanna and Easton Roads, with Bradfield Mansion and Hillside Cemetery. Next, in the center, behind the 3 houses in front, you can see the monument works. Just in front of the grove of trees is where our school now stands. To the right on Easton Road, you can see just how rural this area was. This little bend in Easton Road is where Riviera Pizza is now located. Notice how the streets still aren't paved. You can see the intersection of Bradfield and Easton Roads, where Faith Community Church now stands. Behind that is the land where John Tyson once had his lime kilns. And continuing further to the right, there's nothing but farmland all the way to Willow Grove Park, except for a little African-American area called Crestmont. But in 1925, that's when it happened. Edward B. Ling, who was the superintendent of Abington schools at that time, approved the construction of a new school for the community of Roslyn. A couple of the old farms had been subdivided, and Ling knew that it was only a matter of time before new homes would be built and there'd be kids who needed a school. This was also, of course, the middle of the Roaring Twenties, so capital to build the school was plentiful. It was on September 22, 1926, over a month behind schedule, that the children of Roslyn School started answering roll call each day. One of the last things in the school to be installed and tested was the heating system, so it wasn't until 1 week later, on September 29th, that the building had proper heating for the first time, and the school was able to have its first full session. The school had 6 teachers and a total enrollment of approximately 100 students. There was no kindergarten at the time, so the school had 1 classroom for each grade, 1 through 6. On October 24, 1929, 3 years and 1 month after Roslyn School opened its doors, the stock market crashed, ushering in the Great Depression. As you might imagine, growth in the area slowed. Roslyn at that time was already primarily a blue-collar neighborhood, so like everywhere else, several of Roslyn's parents lost their jobs, resorting to whatever work they could find. So many of Roslyn's residents at that time were poor. By the mid-1930s, Roslyn School was doing its part every Thanksgiving and Christmas by serving free holiday dinners in the cafeteria. In some ways, though, maybe we didn't suffer quite as badly as other areas. Partially because of the beautiful surroundings and the nearby Willow Grove Park, the general area around here had become a popular vacation spot. There was also standard pressed steel nearby and the hospital to keep some folks employed, although the Depression had taken its toll on Tyson's lime kilns, which closed by 1939. And since one of Roslyn's main industries was still burials, of course people didn't stop dying just because there was a depression going on, so the monument and rose businesses still did okay. But keep in mind, other than what remained of Tyson's lime quarries, much of the rest of the area consisted of trees and fields, with bluebells and raspberry bushes lining the railroad tracks that ran along Easton Road. And although many home plots had been identified, the only neighborhood here that really had any houses to speak of was the area just a few blocks between Colonial Avenue, Brookdale, Susquehanna, and Easton Roads. Boarding homes were the norm for single women, and it was frowned upon for married women to work. Like everyone else, teachers would take the train or the trolley to get to the school to work. And if they weren't going the right direction, you'd probably have to walk, since there weren't too many people with cars back then. There also weren't all that many kids in the area then either, especially older kids, so passing the time outside of school wasn't like it is now. The total school enrollment was still around 120 at that time, and in 1940, it was reported that there still were only 15 or 16 teenagers living in the neighborhood. For younger kids, there was a Cub Scout troop, which started here in 1939. And around that time, there was also a scout camp, the Wonderland Scout Reservation, nearby up on the hill in what is now called the Abington Woods section of Roslyn.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On December 7, 1941, the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor, thrusting our entire country into war. The school would have air raid drills. The alarm would sound, and all of the students would have to file quickly and quietly downstairs to the cafeteria. There were big wooden shutters that would be closed over all of the cafeteria windows, and the students would have to get down under the cafeteria tables until the drill was over. And while the war raged on, of course we had rationing of certain key goods here in the States. And the place that was designated to distribute the ration books was the 1888 building. The primary goods rationed were gasoline, rubber, sugar, and coffee. But during all of this, because the area was accessible by train and trolley, nearby Willow Grove Park started to become popular with Navy sailors, who would visit the park while on leave from both the Philadelphia Naval Yard and the Willow Grove Naval Base. They no doubt found the surrounding area to be attractive. And while some new home construction was starting in the area, sometimes even using inexpensive prefabricated housing, many of them took note of the area and started settling here.
Young man, you march right back to your classroom this instant! Now, where were we? Oh, yes. The war, of course, ended in 1945, and our boys came home within a year after that. And there were a few new houses being built around here then, but nobody could have predicted what happened next.
In 1950, exactly 5 years after the end of the war, a tremendous increase in the number of kindergarteners started storming the school. Roslyn had actually started the kindergarten in 1947, but nobody could have anticipated this. I mean, here we were, a little 7-room schoolhouse, and things just started going crazy. See, partially due to our boys coming home from the war, there had been a very quiet start to what in the next 10 years was to be the biggest building boom our area has ever seen. First, it was the area of Birchwood, Rosewood, and Fernwood Avenues across the creek, and 2 streets of homes on Mildred and East Avenue. Then it was Arnold Avenue, and the prefabs on High. By 1950, there were an estimated 1,000 homes in Roslyn, an increase of maybe 50% over 10 years before. And of course, every Navy sailor and every other kind of GI wanted to come home, put the war behind them, and start a family. It was the baby boom, and our little school needed to do something about it. Two of the teachers working in Roslyn at that time were Joe Frankenfield and Peggy Cox. They had started working at Roslyn a year earlier, in 1949, for salaries of $2,500 and $2,300 per year, respectively. Dr. Eugene Stull was the principal by then, and the total number of faculty and staff at that time was 13. Other than Joe, Dr. Stull, and one other male teacher, Mr. Jost, the entire staff was comprised of women, and Joe was the only teacher who owned a car. Everyone else still commuted by trolley. Miss Cox taught 2nd grade, and she recalls that by 1950, she had 39 children in her class. The total school enrollment was well over 200 by that time, meaning the school population had doubled over the last 10 years. Plans were quickly drawn up for a new wing to Roslyn School, containing 4 new classrooms and a health room, which opened in 1951. And it's a good thing, too, because by December 1952, enrollment was up to 587 students. Meanwhile, Mr. Frankenfield and Miss Cox, who met at Roslyn, started dating, which ultimately led to their marriage in 1952. Because of their marriage, they fully expected that the school would ask one of them to take a job elsewhere in the district. After all, this was a time when it was strongly preferred for female teachers to be unmarried, and if a married teacher were to become pregnant, she was expected to resign. However, presumably because of the need for experienced teachers, they were allowed to stay. A second wing was opened in February of 1953. By that September, enrollment was up to 698 students. By the next year, in spite of the addition of the second wing, it was decided that grades 1 through 3 would have intensive half-day sessions, rather than have all the students there all of the time. According to Mrs. Frankenfield, the students for the morning session would start class at 8 a.m. and then have one intensive session all morning until noon without any breaks. No recess, no lunch, just class time straight through. Then, starting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a second teacher would take over the same classroom and teach the afternoon kids until 5 p.m. Each teacher would still be required to work a full day, so they were provided a desk where they could prepare lesson plans and so forth during the times they were not teaching. The half sessions continued for over a year and a half. Finally, in February of 1955, the student population immediately dropped to 464 children due to the opening of the brand new Hamilton School, which now served the northeastern portion of Roslyn. At the beginning of the school year, it was known at Roslyn that the new school was being constructed. The administration carefully assigned class sections so that everyone who was slated to attend the new school would be together, so none of the sections would need to be split up. So, at the end of the second marking period, just as kids were getting their report cards, several entire class sections and their teachers were moved over to Hamilton. The Hamilton School offered at least some relief to the burgeoning Roslyn School, although even then, the population continued to grow. By this time, Roslyn had grown to a total of 1,700 homes, a 70% increase over just 5 years before. By the late 50s, it was still necessary to use every inch of available space to accommodate the student population. There was still a 6th grade class in a dreary room in the basement, and what little physical education there was taught either outside or in a makeshift gym in the room next to the boiler room. So by 1961, a new addition was added, including 4 new classrooms, a music room, and one more thing sorely needed: a gymnasium. By this time, the principal was Dorothy Studley, affectionately known to her staff as Dot. And unlike my way of doing things, which struck fear into the hearts of students, her approach was much, much different. Dare I say it? Even radical. Instead of being feared, Dot Studley was actually revered by both staff and students alike. She had a warm manner and even a sense of humor. During assemblies, she would play this bizarre musical instrument called a pogo cello, which was a 6-foot-long stringed instrument with a banjo head. Ones like it had sometimes been seen being played by the great Philadelphia Mummers, and the kids loved it. And if you had done something that caused you to be sent to the principal's office, it was much more likely that she would try to talk to you, to get you to understand what to do instead of misbehaving, rather than the trusty old ways of marching and waving paddles around. And in the student handbook created under Mrs. Studley's direction, it is written, "The principal is to be looked upon as a friend of children and adults." Too often, parents and teachers use the principal's office as a threat to youngsters. The principal was now truly your pal. It was now the parents' role to discipline their children, and the school's job was to relay information to the parents when a child misbehaved. So now, instead of fearing direct physical contact, children feared that their parents would find out if they did anything bad. But this change in attitude wasn't only because of Mrs. Studley. It was happening in the rest of the country as well. It was the start of the Cold War, and in 1957, the Russians beat us into space by launching Sputnik, the first space satellite. Americans feared that our education system would fall behind. Prior to this, all students were expected to learn identically, with no regard for their personal strengths and weaknesses. By the late 50s and early 60s, the focus was moving towards individualized instruction, identifying the different needs of students and meeting those needs. This was truly the age where Roslyn's commitment to excellence, kindness, and always doing the right thing were born. And it carries through even to today. One example of Dot Studley's vision in this way had to do with diversity. In 1969, just 6 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, Mrs. Studley hired Roslyn's first teacher of color, Mrs. Jacqueline Porter, whose name at that time was Miss Poe. And although this was a time when many communities may have found such a thing to be controversial, Mrs. Porter reports that she was warmly welcomed with open arms by faculty, parents, and students alike. Not only that, but she turned out to be an excellent hire too. Today, she's put in over 35 years of service, making her the longest currently employed teacher at Roslyn. And in 2002, she was Abington School District's Teacher of the Year nominee to the Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year competition, an honor that had never before been bestowed upon a teacher at Roslyn. By the 1970s, things were starting to settle down. As the baby boom started to wane, the student population started to decrease across the school district. So in 1976, the Abington School Board voted to reduce the total number of elementary schools in the district from 12 to 7. Roslyn School made it through unscathed. However, 5 elementary schools, including the Hamilton, Ardsley, North Hills, Cedar Road, and Cadwallader schools, were closed. The Hamilton school kids who lived in the Woodland North area between Woodland and Patane Avenues were again sent to Roslyn, as they were 20 years prior. And we also picked up some children from Ardsley. In the late 70s, Bert Dares became principal of Roslyn, and then Janet Vassian took over the position a few years after that. But other than a few relatively minor teachers' strikes, the period of the 70s and 80s was largely uneventful, and Roslyn continued its tradition of excellence. On September 5th, 1996, Hurricane Fran slammed into the southern coast of North Carolina, bringing sustained winds of 115 miles per hour and causing an estimated $2.3 billion in damage in its path in the south. 3 days later, on September 8th, the remnants of Fran had traveled up to Pennsylvania. In what was described as a storm that would only occur once every 1,000 years, the storm dumped a record of over 10 inches of rain on our area within a 45-minute period. One resident recalled that he had never ever seen so much rain filling the air as it fell from the sky. flash flooding was everywhere, and Roslyn, being one of the lowest lying areas nearby, bore much of the brunt. Owing partially to some recent construction in the hillside cemetery area, floodwaters traveled down the cemetery hill and across Susquehanna Road, seeking the lowest point. And that lowest point happened to be Roslyn's basement. With over 6 feet of water in the basement, Roslyn's cafeteria, art room, computer room, and boiler were destroyed. In addition, water and mud flooded much of the east wing of the school, including several classrooms and the gym. The cost to repair the damage would be upwards of $750,000. Fortunately, the disaster occurred on a Sunday when school wasn't in session, or the potential danger to students would have been unthinkable. Unfortunately, however, the disaster hit just 4 days after the start of the new school year. After closing school for 3 days, the administration decided to send half of the children to Knesset Israel in Elkins Park and the other half to Ardsley Community Center, which was formerly the Ardsley Elementary School that had been closed in 1976. In the community, the areas most hard hit were those that bordered the Sandy Run Creek, where the creek had swollen to epic proportions. A total of 8 homes were fully destroyed, and hundreds of homes, businesses, and apartments were flooded to the point of being uninhabitable without significant repairs. Remarkably, in the entire ordeal, only 2 people died. And yet, in spite of this horrendous tragedy, and the fact that in 1996 we couldn't even use our own school building to teach our children, it was in that year that Roslyn Elementary School was awarded the prestigious Blue Ribbon School of Excellence Award from the state of Pennsylvania. And it was that same year that Abington School District was identified as one of the top 100 school districts in the country by Money Magazine. And as an outpouring of community and family support continued through the 1996-1997 school year, our PSSA scores started flying off the charts. 2 Roslyn students even achieved perfect scores on the PSSA in 1996, and by 1997, Roslyn had achieved the rank of number 1 in the state of Pennsylvania in reading and number 5 in the state in math. Hurricane Fran may have been a terrible disaster, but it caused our community to become stronger, more unified, and more proud than ever. As the old saying goes, as adopted by Roslyn's principal at that time, Jan Klein, it really does take a village to educate a child. And when that village pulls together the way ours did and still does, the results are nothing short of sensational. And even when a second flood occurred in the summer of 2001, just after new principal Toby Grant took the helm, we still weren't deterred, scoring number 1 in reading in Montgomery County and number 3 in Pennsylvania that same year, and even improving student proficiency overall by 2003 and winning a PA Achievement Award. From its humble beginnings as a one-room schoolhouse in what ultimately grew to be a simple community of everyday working people, Roslyn Elementary truly has become the little school that could. The tradition of excellence started by Dot Studley back in the 1950s had grown and matured into a philosophy that not only permeates the school, but touches everyone in the community as well. The administration cares. The teachers care. The parents care, and this teaches the students how to care.
T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have booster ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Discovery has cleared the tower at FM 39, rolling around to the upper and to place the spacecraft on a 28.5 degree inclination orbit.
and John Tyson would have been proud. Having rescued his own son from a strict and even abusive school environment, little could he have known of the success that would ultimately grow from the school community that he unwittingly created, way back when Roslyn was just a crossroads in the middle of nowhere.